An ordinary businessman leaving his office late and tired. A housewife finishing the shopping and in a hurry to collect the kids from school. The end of a family outing, a day in the sun, followed by a long, tiring drive home. Different situations may be, but nevertheless very ordinary, everyday occurrences for each of us, but each of them with a potential for contributing to a motor vehicle crash. And the point is that crashes don't just happen. They are caused, and in almost every case there can be a great many contributing factors. Last week we looked at the things that you need to have going for you in case you do have a collision. This week we look at the things that you should never do if you'd like to avoid colliding in a car. Now, you've heard all this before, but it is worth repeating, so let's begin by making a list of the times when you should never drive. You should never drive when you're under the influence of any alcohol or drugs. You should never drive when you are ill or when you are suffering from any incapacitating injury. And you should never drive when you are super tired. Strangely enough, you should also never drive when you're in a terrific hurry, because it tends to upset your nervous system and that's not good for your driving. So perhaps when you are in a terrific hurry, you should drive even more slowly. Let's take a look at that. The problem with being in a hurry in a car is that it introduces a very high stress factor, such that your judgment is clouded, you tend to move yourself into the wrong lanes and then become balked, which puts you in an even greater hurry, and then you become balked again because you've moved to the wrong lane again, caught yourself behind a car turning right. Almost everything that happens to you slows you down, and because you're in a hurry, that introduces an even higher degree of stress. Look, you know how you feel, you've been there. You've become agitated by lights that change and you want to try to beat them. You become agitated by traffic moving slowly, so you move into another lane and find that it isn't moving at all. Everything that goes wrong, that happens, goes wrong. Nothing works for you properly. In the long term, such is the degree of stress, such your agitation, that you're almost certain to find yourself in trouble one way or the other. Either you'll have a policeman pulling alongside you asking you to pull over, driver, or else you'll find yourself in a situation just like this. If you're very lucky, a near miss is as close as you'll get. On the other hand, if you've been driving the way we suggested last week, then even a near miss is not necessary. You could have avoided any sort of dreaded crash situation. Just a little while ago I mentioned stress. Stress evolves, as far as driving is concerned, from being in a hurry. Rush, tear, bustle around the city, really, most of the time, going nowhere. Some studies in Europe have indicated that the stress that's induced by driving in a hurry is akin to having a heart attack. second point I'd like to raise with you concerns the effects of alcohol and drugs. And I just thought you might like to know how those two substances might affect you. And there are two ways. One fairly obvious, the sort of physical effect that's pretty common, and another one a good deal more subtle. But let's think about the physical effects first. And to do that, we've got two tests to show you, and I'll just describe the first one to you. This little gadget down here has got two rifle bolts. And it takes 22 cartridge with chalk in it. And it's actuated in the first place by the passenger, who throws a switch which fires the first piece of chalk, and on the sound of the firing of that piece of chalk, the driver hits the brake pedal. And as soon as the brake pedal is struck, the second piece of chalk is fired. Thus, two marks on the ground a certain distance apart, and it's possible to measure how far, and that distance represents exactly the distance covered for reaction time. So we can see whether reaction time deteriorates as alcohol is ingested into the system. The second of these tests is a little like our standard swerve test. It is, in fact, a change of direction. What we ask a driver to do is to come straight down a lane, which looks much like any other lane and is about that width, and then go either right or left according to a direction from one of these two lights, which will switch on at a certain given moment, and to be able to do so with accuracy and without knocking over any witches' hats. And we want to see whether there is, again, any deterioration of performance. We have to have a subject for these tests, of course, and that poor unfortunate is Adrian Ireland, with whom I've been working for about 6 years, and I know he's driving very well. I know that usually it's fairly consistent. We're going to let him drink a little bit later on, but right now he'll be doing the first series of tests quite sober. Now, if you'll just get the car up to 60 kilometres per hour and then hold that speed steady, and as soon as you hear the gun, jump on the brakes. We put Adrian through the braking test 3 times, and his distances from 60 kilometres per hour to standstill were 6.1 metres, 5.4 metres and 6 metres exact. That's an average of 5.8 metres. 5.4. And 6, exactly. In the lane change exercise, Adrian was averaging a 60% success rate. The light comes on very late, and 40% of the time he had already committed himself. The important thing is that his driving was smooth and safe. Then we got him to drink 5 middies in an hour, which brought his blood alcohol level up to 0.08, the legal limit in New South Wales. The first test was the braking test again. This is really incredible. Remember that in the first case we had 6.1, 5.4 and 6 metres. That's firstly very consistent, close together, with an average of 5.8 metres for the 3 stops. At 0.08, the distances are 6.4, 8.6 and 12.4, an average of 9.1. Half as far again, more than half as far again. What's more, it's inconsistent. There's no pattern to it. In other words, the driver really doesn't know how he's going to stop at any given time. And the difference between the stops sober and the stops with some degree of drunkenness are almost exactly the difference between crashing and not crashing. That's pretty devastating news. Take it to heart. Now let's try the lane change sequence, and bear in mind that I've already pointed out that there is a degree of guesswork in that, so he might get some of them right and some of them wrong, but the real point to look for is the degree of controllability. In the lane change exercise, Adrian's success rate dropped 20%, but his smoothness and control was well down, as evidenced by his last run. What we've just done is to confirm what we've known for some considerable time, that blood alcohol concentration levels in excess of 0.08 or even 0.05 will impair to a very substantial degree the skills required to drive a car. What I'd like to know is, at what level does that impairment begin, and how does alcohol affect people at low levels rather than at the high levels we've just seen? Dr. Stomer, could you tell us please what this machine does?
Yes. In this test, the subject sits and looks at an array of lights which come on and off. Some come on straight in front of him, some in the periphery of his vision. What he has to do is to watch them closely, and when 4 of them form a square, then he responds by pressing a button. But that's not the only thing he has to do. He has to do another thing. He's got to watch that light display there, and there's a constantly changing array of coloured lights, and he has to look for a colour change sequence which goes blue to amber to red. When he sees that sequence, then he presses another button, and the machine records the number of correct responses he makes and the number of errors which occur.
Doctor, what will the information from the test tell you?
Well, it tells us a little bit about his ability to deal with a divided attention task, which has fairly obvious relationships to the driving situation, except, of course, it's much more simple.
And what results do you get that indicate different levels of performance for different levels of alcohol?
Well, as he gets drunker, you will see that he makes many more mistakes, but more importantly, he fails to see the stimuli, particularly those that occur in the periphery of his vision. And you also find that he makes more mistakes in the colour test, where he's got to keep a sequence in his mind and then respond. And he finds it very difficult to do those 2 tasks at the same time.
At what levels of alcohol concentration do you begin to see a result?
Well, as with all our tests, or practically all of them, we start to see the first statistical differences around about 0.03. By 0.05, almost everyone is showing some decrement in performance. By 0.08, it's increased, and by something like 0.15, which is the mean or the average blood alcohol concentration that the police find on breath analysis, people are grossly impaired. They just can't function.
So if you see some sort of result at 0.03, then alcohol begins to take effect before we recognise it.
Oh yes, certainly. At the stage where well, there's another thing too that comes in as far as most people are concerned, and that is that their confidence and their aggression also increases very markedly with even quite low concentrations of alcohol, and this means, of course, that their risk-taking behaviour increases, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with seeing that sort of thing on the roads on a Friday or a Saturday night.
Okay, so if they are more confident, more likely to take risks, they are also less able to see and to react to things going on around them.
That's right. Well, behaviourally, the driving task is sometimes described as a two-component task. One, a sort of continuous tracking, where you attempt to keep the vehicle on the road in the right place at the right speed, and the second is a sort of search, recognise and react scan, where you look for something untoward which is likely to happen, and then you put into execution the sort of manoeuvres that are necessary to get you out of trouble. It's that sort of information processing which gets really shot by alcohol.
In a sober condition, Adrian scored 9 out of 10 on the control panel, 3 out of 4 on the side panels, and 3 out of 5 for the colours. At 0.05, he achieved only 7 out of 10 in the centre, 2 out of 4 on the periphery, and 3 out of 6 for the colours. That's after only 2.5 to 3 drinks, and nowhere near the 0.08 limit. His later results don't bear thinking about. Could you explain the effect of the loss of peripheral vision?
It's not so much as a loss of peripheral vision. It's rather that the attention seems to be directed to what is straight ahead, and things are not seen. But whether it's an actual loss of vision or whether it's merely what the individual chooses to see is another matter. This is certainly made use of by police motorcyclists who sit in the periphery of the vision of people that they wish to pick up.
So your vision is concentrated straight ahead of you, literally?
It appears to be, yes.
We, the public, tend to concentrate all our attention around alcohol, but as I understand it, there are similar side effects from some drug groups as well. Do you get the same results from your tests?
You can do, but there's an important difference. You see, alcohol is taken for, if you like, recreational purposes, whereas drugs are, if one discounts the abusers, are mostly taken to treat symptoms. So you've got a situation where a driver may be safer with his medication than without it, and this must be true for an awful lot of situations. But there are an enormous number of drugs available. There are perhaps 3,000 prescription items which are available in Australia, and almost an equivalent number of things you can buy over the counter from the chemist. And so the number of combinations somebody can have aboard is almost limitless. But it's fair to say that of those drugs, most of them don't interfere with driving ability at all, but some of them do. Things like certain antihistamines, tranquilizers, general anesthetics up to 48 hours after a person's been anesthetized for even a minor operation. You can show that his performance is less than it would be normally. Hangover effects from sleeping tablets. Now and certain things that certain antibiotics and things like that can cause problems. But the big area, of course, of worry is the interaction of drugs with alcohol. and the way that they can adversely affect someone's driving ability. I mean, you could put it like this, that an individual could be used to drinking a couple of beers on his way home from work every night, and he's done this for years and he's not got into any sort of trouble. But suddenly he does get into trouble within the first few days of starting some new therapy, and all this is rather outside his experience, and really we ought to be trying to identify those drugs which cause problems so that the patients can be advised accordingly.
Do we know which drug groups are the worst mixers with alcohol?
Well, I've got a bit of evidence that we could perhaps talk about. Ross McPherson and I did some work recently on drugs which drivers who were breathalyzed stated that they were taking at the time when they were breathalyzed, and we looked at some 42,000 of these in New South Wales, and we found that about 15% of these drivers said that they'd been taking some drug or other. Now, we broke these down into drug categories, and we looked at whether there was a greater crash incidence in the drug plus alcohol group as opposed to the alcohol alone, within sort of given blood alcohol ranges and within age ranges. And we found that a certain number of drugs did pop out as being associated with an increased crash risk, and these were things like antidepressants and tranquilizers and some of the stronger analgesics, those sort of things. We're not trying to say that these drugs actually caused crashes when they were mixed with alcohol, because obviously there are many factors involved in a crash, but we are saying that we have a certain amount of evidence to suggest that this is a factor that ought to be looked at.
And all three are fairly commonly taken, are they not?
Oh, very commonly, yes. In fact, the central nervous system depressants, that's the tranquilizer group, were in fact the biggest group amongst all of the drugs that we found.
I guess the most obvious point that comes out of the interview with Dr. Starmer is that the thing we have to do most is to change social attitudes towards drinking and driving. And that obviously is going to be extraordinarily difficult, particularly with the Australian society's attitude as it is at the moment. The responsibility for doing that, of course, remains with us. And I suggest it's worth giving it a try at least. One thing we didn't get around to in that interview was to discuss the subject of marijuana specifically, and I've subsequently discovered for you that it in fact has a more profound and longer lasting effect than alcohol, and that marijuana and alcohol mixed are positively devastating. Our last two influences are irritation and tiredness. This is a classic irritating situation. Late evening traffic, chaotic, confused, slow moving. And you can tell the people that are irritated, they're flashing their lights or blowing their horn or consistently changing lanes unnecessarily, almost invariably causing some sort of near accident, if not a real collision. And all they really had to do was to relax and accept it. Just before we leave the subject of crashes and how to avoid them, I'd like to make a point about motorcycles. They do not operate in the same way as motor cars. They don't corner as easily, they can't always stop like cars, and they are much harder to control in emergencies. You'll remember Torque's standard swerve and recover exercise that we do with most of our road tests. It's designed to simulate an obstacle suddenly being thrown in your path, a child running out, something of that nature. Well, it's difficult enough to do with a car where you've got a steering wheel and four wheels firmly placed on the ground. But it's much more difficult with a motorcycle because the motorcycle is steered principally with a transfer of body weight. Now, to demonstrate that, we've got Ron Bolden, one of Australia's top competition motorcyclists. First, let's run the Mazda through and then the bike. Provided the bike starts well out, he can handle it reasonably easily. But it's almost impossible if he's well over to the left, as he would be in normal circumstances like this. First the Mazda, staying well in its lane. But watch the bike when he has to turn and brake. When it comes to braking, there's a fairly substantial difference again between the performance of a car and a motorcycle. Under normal circumstances, on a reasonable road in the dry, a motorbike will outbrake a car almost every time. You can bank on it. Meaning that, of course, you shouldn't drive too close, because when the motorcyclist stops, you'll wear him as a mascot. On the other hand, if it's wet, you'll be able to stop better in your car than the motorcyclist will. And that particularly means that if the road is anything other than perfect bitumen, things are going to get worse. Rough bumps, a little bit of gravel, a little bit of mud, and the motorcyclist is going to have a great deal of difficulty stopping. So again, give him room. In this series of talk, we've looked closely at three specific subjects: the economics of motoring, the conservation of the environment, and, most recently, at your personal safety. All three subjects will continue to involve us right through the 1980s. When there are new questions to be asked about motoring in Australia, we'll be around to answer them, but not for a little while yet. I hope you've enjoyed this series. Good night.
So we say farewell for the time being to Peter Wherrett. Next Wednesday night on ABC, we'll be given over to the big wheels of the Australian film industry for a preview of that and what will literally be a night of stars. Stay with us. And stay with us for tonight's drama in the series Spring and Fall.